only mode.
All right, well, hopefully everyone can hear me. Hi, and good afternoon, and welcome to the REST+JSON Software Tech Dive into Tin Can. I'm Ben Clark, and I've been involved in e-learning since 2005 when I started doing development of a SCORM implementation for a major LMS. Since then, I've been a vocal participant in the ADL Technical Working Group. And since 2010, I've been envisioning, designing, and implementing the Tin Can API. Also joining us is David Els. Do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. I'm David. I've been here at REST+JSON Software for about 4 years, done all kinds of different things, including a bunch of work on our SCORM Cloud product. And about a year ago, joined Ben and took sort of this first version of the spec and dug into an implementation with them and sort of took a run at it. And we've been coding on it ever since. And yeah, built a bunch of prototypes and tools and stuff like that. I'm going to kind of be a dialogue buddy, a somewhat silent partner. I'm going to be here in the background answering your questions as you type them in, and maybe throwing a few up for discussion here.
All right, thanks, David. So that was a good point you raised about the questions. You should all see a question box on your screen. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them there. David will be replying to some of them. Andy is also on the call, and he'll also reply to some of them. And then we'll try to hit some of them at the question and answer session at the end. And anything we don't get to, we will post along with a recording of this session. So what we're going to be talking about is, first of all, very briefly, some history of how we got here, the core concepts behind Tin Can, which really will focus on statements and the LRS, an introduction of the API itself. Then these next 3 points really all have to do with statements. First of all, we're talking about statements at their most basic level. Then some of the objects which are part of statements. As you see, we're really focused on statements because Tin Can itself is actually really focused on statements. Towards the end, we're going to be doing a demo, and then we're going to be talking about how you can get started working with Tin Can and participating in the spec process if you want to, and then finally the question and answer session. Okay, so first of all, SCORM. Hopefully you're all familiar with SCORM already, but very briefly, it is plumbing. It is an interoperability standard which allows courseware to communicate with an LMS and to be packaged and imported into it. It's been around for over 10 years, and it's really solved a lot of problems very well. But there's some that really couldn't have been envisioned 10 years ago, and that's why we had a project in Can, is ADL, Advanced Distributed Learning, which is a research organization under the U.S. Department of Defense, and they created SCORM. They decided to research a successor to SCORM, and that's where Project Tin Can got started, which was the research project that I undertook at REST+JSON Software, along with others, to investigate what a successor to the runtime portion of SCORM should look like. So we started out by doing some outreach. We interviewed a lot of folks involved in learning and e-learning in particular, and we also had a user voice forum where people could talk about what they wanted to see changed, what they wanted to do that they couldn't do, what their needs were.
Yeah,
so, sorry, go ahead. David? Oh, okay, sorry for the interruption.
That's not me, that's fine.
Okay. Anyway.
Although if I've got the chance, I'd like to, if I do have a chance, I'd like to throw in, Ben mentioned the user voice interviews, and we have those hosted on swarm.com. I'll post the link here in a second. But I know a lot of folks with us are coders and interested in technology, interested in e-learning and what's coming next, and those interviews are a very rich source of thought about what we could build next. So I'll post that for everybody.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. So there was a lot that came out of that, but just some of the highlights. People wanted to enable distributed content, more portable content. They wanted to be able to get at their data. I mean, in SCORM, you can get the data back that you just submitted in the runtime, or if you relaunch, you can get back to it, but they wanted more access to the data for reporting and other purposes. And they really want to be able to track experiences outside the LMS and to better enable mobile experiences. And the list just goes on. So I'm going to move on. If you want to hear more about the sorts of things that Project Tin Can enables, then I suggest you go and look at Bike's webinar. Also for more historical context, or really if you're interested in the answer to why should you care about Tin Can. His presentation is great for that. But I'm going to be moving on and talking a lot more about the how as opposed to the why. So anyway, yes, then we've gone on and with the community after we, sorry, excuse me, I have to back up. So after we did all that outreach, we came up with a proposal for a specification that would solve a lot of these problems, support a lot of these use cases. We presented that to ADL, and we thought it was pretty good, and so did they. So that was then presented to the community, and its adoption or an interest in it has really taken off, and there's been a version 0.9 and a version 0.95. That the community has helped work to develop, and there have been quite a few adopters. Again, if you see Mike's webinar, he'll talk more about the adoption. In the rest of this webinar, I'm going to talk about version 0.95. You should know that version 0.9 is out there, and particularly if you're thinking that you're someone who is going to be accepting statements or what would traditionally be the role of an LMS, then you probably want to go and get yourself familiar with 0.9 as well, because there are 0.9 clients out there, and it's going to be in your interest possibly to support them. Okay, so key concepts behind Tin Can. The building block of Tin Can, the most important thing is the statement, which in its simplest form is, I did this. We're going to talk a lot more about statements. Now, something very important to keep in mind about statements is that statements are forever. They are immutable, they cannot be edited, they cannot be deleted. If you create a statement that you don't like, the very most you can do is you can create another statement that says that statement is voided. Then people will have both of those statements, and they will be able to see that even though at some point in the past you asserted something was the case, you came back and said, hey, that was a mistake. And as we talk about the Learning Records Store, you'll see why that is a good thing. But it's something anyway that you need to keep very firmly in mind. Another thing to really think about is that anything can make statements about anything. You're probably used to models in which you have, say, a piece of content, it gets launched by an LMS, and it tracks data about itself. The way Tin Can works, there's a complete separation between what is actually creating statements or tracking and what it is making those statements about. There certainly will be many cases where there will be something created to make statements about conceptually itself, but it does not have to be the case at all. Then it's also very important to keep in mind, these terms we'll talk about further as we dive into statements. But in I did this, I is an agent, which is basically just something that can perform an action. You might think of it as a learner in a more traditional learning environment. Activities are generally the object of a statement, the this. Think courses in a more traditional environment. But they both exist independent of any system. And this is, in the real world, this is kind of obvious. There are learning activities, and there are, of course, agents or really people, and they don't exist within a system. So we want to be able to talk about them without being tied to any one system. So the way these are referred to in statements is not tied to, it doesn't have to be any way tied to any particular system. Finally, the last thing to main concept I want to get across before we dive into statements is the concept of the Learning Records Store, or LRS. So, an LRS at its simplest is simply something which can record learning records and it can return them. We got to thinking about this when we were talking about what the Tin Can API would communicate with, and we were talking about an LMS, but we said, well, yeah, frequently it's going to be talking to an LMS, but there could be other systems that might want to support this API that maybe a reporting system directly, that sort of thing. So we got to pulling out this concept. And then with the fact that an LRS is something that can both record and return statements, we came to see that an LRS also could be a way to start pulling statements together, or pulling information together, learning information, and then it can provide that information to various different systems. And as you can see along the bottom, with the Tin Can API, there's many different sorts of things that can connect to an LRS and track. Okay, so another way to envision an LRS here, I showed before an example where LRSs could be feeding data to an LMS. We also thought that people might very likely want the functionality of an LRS within an LMS. That might very well be a common way to implement this. In this case, LMSs have reporting systems as well, which would be tied into the LRS. And the LRS itself can become a way for LMSs to share data between themselves as long as they put it into the LRS first. Again, coming down to this ability of LRSs to share data with each other, to share statements with each other. So circling back to why are statements forever? Statements are forever because we have an API which enables them to be not just stored, but retrieved and passed from system to system. And it just gets to be a real horribly ugly mess if you start allowing the editing or deletion of a statement on one system. How does that replicate to other systems? So the concept of keeping it as a simple stream and issuing another voiding statement was used. So how does this all work? What is the Tin Can API really? The Tin Can API is a set of REST web services using JSON as the payload, and the resource groups, or I'm avoiding the word methods here because it's REST, of course. But anyway, we have these various resource groups that can be used. I'm going to talk mostly about statements because, again, statements are really the most, I almost want to say the most important part. They're the part that almost everyone's going to have to interact with in some way. Then we have state. I'm only very briefly going to touch on state here to say that it is a way that you can store key document pairs. And you would use it where you would previously do something like suspend data or bookmarking. And it is something that persists or you only need to persist for as long as someone is, as a learner is involved with a particular learning activity. It is not meant for permanent storage. Activities and agents, resource those resource endpoints allow you to retrieve information about activities. Think like content or content packages, but it's not that. But if you're putting on a traditional worldview, then that's what this is similar to. Or agents, which would be like learners. You can retrieve information about them that the LRS is aware of, and also can store key document pairs of information that are relevant about those activities or agents, and that can be a way to share information about a particular activity or about a particular agent, aka learner, that various other systems would find useful. So, coming back to statements, and I am really going to focus on statements here because the main thing that I think everyone is going to want to do is to issue statements. They are the main way that we represent information in Tin Can, and they are what can potentially be passed from system to system. So, given those different sub APIs or resource groups, how do you actually use the API? You start with a configuration that includes an endpoint, which is everything prior to that resource group or sub API. And you put on, for example, statements at the end if you want to deal with statements. If you were to issue a GET, assuming there is an LRS endpoint at tincanapi.com LRS, which there isn't, but if there was and you issued a GET to that URL, then you would get back a list of statements that LRS had. Now, there would be limits on how much you get back at once. There's pagination and so on, but it really is as simple as that for just getting statements out of a system. The other thing that clients will have to be configured with is credentials. The Tin Can API supports either authenticating via HTTP basic auth or via OAuth. There are several different ways to use OAuth that are supported, and really to get into them all would be a whole session, I think, unto itself. But very briefly, it's possible to have the traditional model where both the client application connecting and a user jointly authenticate. It's also possible to have models still using OAuth, but where only an application is authenticating or where only a user is authenticating. So what we're sending over this API is JSON. And for those of you who may not have seen JSON in a little while, just here's a little brief snippet to point out what it looks like. So as you can see, we have some properties and some values there. You can have a simple value to a property. You can also have a property which itself contains another set of properties, just another object, really. Or you can nest however many levels deep you want. Now we get to the heart of the matter, which is, what does a tin can statement actually look like? When you actually write out the JSON, what does it have to look like? So this is a pretty simple statement. It's simply contains the required components. I did this, actor, verb, object. The actor in this case is David Ells, identified by his email address, and we'll talk more about actor identity or agent identity in a little bit. And you even just heard me slip up with this a little bit, but there's a little confusion out there about the terms actor and agent. In the spec, when an agent is talked about, that is actually an object that could be an actor. It can perform an action, but when we talk about actor, it is actually something that is in that particular property in the statement actually performing the action. So it's a very fine distinction. but they wind up getting used interchangeably a lot, unfortunately. So then we have the verb, attended in this case. You'll notice that the verb has an ID and a display name. The ID is a URL. We'll be talking more about verbs in detail as we move along. And then the object in this case is an activity, which again I mentioned would be in a more traditional world similar to a course or a package. In this case, we're talking about this Tech Dive webinar. And again, we'll be delving more into that. So, what exactly are statements? They're the most they're the language of Tin Can. They're the basic building block out of which the information you get out of Tin Can is built. They indicate that something has occurred, very typically a learning experience, because that's what they're designed to be able to represent well. They should have, ideally, a good natural language version. And, excuse me, they can be aggregated into streams of activity. They are, which sounds a lot like activity streams. They are inspired, or the Tin Can API was inspired by activity streams. It is not actually compatible with activity streams, but the concept is very similar. So again, the difference here from something like SCORM, where you have a particular attempt or series of attempts where you can read and write data. The Tin Can model is issuing statements, always in a stream, always building on what has happened before. And the way that you would do reporting in Tin Can is to actually take those streams to look at all the statements about what has happened and then build up a picture that way. So again, the basic format of the statement, which we just saw, actor, verb, object, or Sally experienced solo hang gliding. And here, again, a very simple statement with a different verb, a different activity, but again, very simple. So the core object types of the statements are agents and activities. There's also verbs, but they're really just an identifier, so that they didn't quite make that list. Then there's, we'll see as we move on, there are a lot of other properties that can be populated as well. Within a statement, we use unique IDs so that data can be correlated. Again, I guess moving back here for a moment, someone's email address is unique ID. The verb has a URI. The object has a URI. These IDs are all unique in order to be able to correlate data and to acknowledge the fact that activities can exist outside of any system. Learners or agents can exist outside of any system. So we want those statements to be able to make sense, not just against or in the system on which they were issued. So structure is used to add meaning, which is to say that, as we'll see when, as we get to the larger parts of the, some additional parts of the statement, some IDs you can put in various different places in the statement, and it changes the meaning depending on where you put them. We'll see some more on that later. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, we don't want to have agents or learners be restricted so that we can only identify them on one system. It is an option, but we acknowledge that people are identified in different ways. One of the things that people asked for the ability to do was to track a learning event that was not initiated by an LMS. Well, in order for that to happen, we can't necessarily, or it becomes very awkward to get to ask the LMS how it identifies a person first. Rather, it makes more sense just to take something we know uniquely identifies that person and let the LMS, or LRS in this case, know what occurred, and then the LRS, or really the LMS that it is a part of, can take that data and work out if that is a person that it wants to report on. So we're seeing more and more learning being person-centric, not necessarily just driven top-down by the organization. People go out and learn what they want to. They want to be able to report on it. They want to be able to share the fact they have learned. And also just a philosophical idea that if we're creating a way to identify people, that people own their own identities. Now, let me talk a little bit about persona versus person. In an earlier version of the spec, in 0.90, there was the concept of being able to identify a person or to identify an agent multiple ways. There were some definite privacy concerns with that sort of information being passed around, that essentially people have different personas. There's my work persona, there's maybe my persona in my own personal life, maybe me as a student and college is another persona, that although people should own their own identifiers, they might want to keep those personas separate. So now in the current version, agents can be identified only by one of these options: email, OpenID, an account on a system, rather than being identified by multiple emails or an email and an account in a system, and so on. When email and OpenID are pretty clear, by the way, but when we talk about system accounts, what we mean is quite simply the option, which until now in a lot of cases was the only option, of saying that I am identified by my account on my LMS. We can still do that. It's just now it's only an option. Okay. So here are some examples of that. Email we already saw. OpenID is clear enough if you're familiar with OpenID. If not, then you can look into that if you'd like. A system account, as I mentioned, it is just identifying you by your account on any arbitrary system. For those who are concerned about privacy, this is a way that you can identify someone without it being obvious to everyone who they are, particularly if you have some sort of identity provider that will provide account names that are not immediately tied to a user easily. Okay. Before we delve back into some of the more complex types of statements, I want to talk about the use of URIs, because it's been a point of confusion for some implementers of the spec. Activities, activity types, verbs, and extensions, and we'll get to some of those later, are identified by URIs. It is an open vocabulary, which is that you can really pick any URI you want to use. There are, and there will be more, community repositories of these URIs, so that if you want to talk about a particular verb, for example, it makes sense to go and look at one of these repositories to see if the verb exists there. For example, well, I'm going back too far that way. I'll give some examples of verbs here later, of all of these really. Oh, excuse me. So when you are picking something, it is better to pick an identifier that is well known, if it's appropriate, which that's the best choice. If you can't find one that's well known, Ideally, you'd pick one that was published or you publish it yourself. And if you really have to, then you can, in fact, just coin a private identifier and not share it with anyone, though that does leave you with statements that won't really be meaningful or won't be as meaningful if they ever leave your system, which sometimes is the desired behavior, so that's an option. It is very, very important to avoid collisions and reuse. Um, the spec requires full URIs for this reason, that is, including the scheme and, in the case of URL, the domain and so on, rather than just fragments. And the reason is to take availability of the uniqueness of URIs. The trade-off in having activities, verbs, and so on, which are defined and make sense across various systems, is that everyone has to make very sure not to step on each other's toes, and it's necessary to pick a URI which either is known to have a particular meaning, or to make sure that when you create your own URI, that you do it in a domain that you control, so that others won't go and use your URI to mean something else. So just again, something to keep in mind, and a very important point there. Now, ADL has provided a list of the verbs and activity types that were used in 0.9. So that is a great place to start if this is just too wide open to start with, which it is, frankly. There's going to be people who very much like to create their own activity types and verbs and so on, but definitely a lot of people would prefer to start with existing lists. And this is a great place to start, where some of the common verbs, such as completed, attempted, past, etc., have been defined and that you can go ahead and use. All right, activities. In I did this, this part, or the object, is usually an activity. We won't talk about this too much, but another option is that you can actually have the object be an agent, which makes sense for certain sorts of statements, like I mentored someone else. Frequently, this will be an activity, like I attended the Tin Can Tech webinar. Anyway, activities have a unique ID, which we just talked about, and also a definition. And they should be defined by some organization, or they can be defined by either organization or application. Again, you certainly can, with these URIs, you certainly can go off and coin your own. You just need to make sure that there are no collisions, because if there are collisions, then you are really asserting that when you talk about the same URI, that you are talking about the same thing as everyone else who has talked about that URI is talking about. So you want to make sure those collisions don't happen. These typically map to real-world activities. And in the more traditional model, these would typically be something like a course, an assessment, a web page. You can also get into other sorts of activities, which some of our examples will show, which are really not that. If you want to get really granular with your statements, you can get really granular with your activities. So you could say that I answered this particular test question correctly. So you can go down to that level, and that's how you can vary your level of one of the ways you can vary your level of granularity is by varying the level of granularity of your statements. I'm sorry, of your activities. All right, so yeah, And this is what a activity looks like. The definition, when you attach an activity to a statement, is optional. You can and sometimes should just attach the ID. If you've already sent the definition, the LRS already has it. There's no need to send it with every statement. There is only one definition for an activity. So just sending different definitions for the same activity is something you should avoid doing, because again, one activity ID always logically means the same thing no matter how many different definitions you give it. The assumption is if there's different definitions associated with the same activity ID, that they are minor corrections, maybe a spelling mistake, something like that. The meaning should always stay the same. So here's a activity of solo hang gliding, which is not necessarily your typical course. It's an experience that's happening out in the real world. Going back to the concept that that anything can make statements about anything, solo hang gliding is not a piece of e-learning content, so there's no way it can make statements about itself, but an instructor might have an application where they can make statements about how the student has done with their solo hang gliding. So here we see that the activity structure supports internationalization. So I don't have too much to say about that. This list could be much longer with additional languages, and sometimes that'll be very desirable depending on how broadly these statements are being shared. Okay, verbs. As I said when I was talking about URIs, they are an open vocabulary. It is very important to get these URIs correct and make sure they are unique and that you're not stepping on anyone's toes. The verb IDs map to a meaning, not a word. So I wrote fired here because, for example, the word fired as a verb could mean fired a kiln, fired an employee, or fired a weapon, for example. Those would be, in a tin can world, 3 different verbs. They might all have a label of fired, but the ID maps to a meaning. So by use of verbs, we can allow objects to be real objects by using verbs other than, I guess, very traditional e-learning verbs like completed. And by this being an open vocabulary, we can make very expressive statements. Actually, completed isn't a great example of that, but we can envision that there would be other verbs that would be more interesting there. Completed is an example of one of the ADL's list of verbs. Really, everyone who looks at the spec is going to find out about ADL's list of verbs. So when you're reporting on these, you're going to be guaranteed interoperability if you use those verbs. Otherwise, interoperability, or at least interoperable understanding, is a matter of coordination. You want to publish the verbs you are using. You want to avoid using using a verb that's already in use to mean something other than other people are using it to mean. And finally, if you do make up your own verbs and don't publish them, you can still, oh, excuse me, I just hit the keyboard, yeah. You can still certainly use those internally, and that's certainly an option. Okay. Very quickly, the difference between, you have a choice whether to use the verb or activity to indicate certain things. In this example, we're talking about experiencing solo hang gliding at Mount Magazine. So now the verb is more generic. The object includes the fact that you're talking about hang gliding. there's pros and cons to doing this. Let me show another way to do this. You could instead say that you hang glided Mount Magazine, or you could say that, or you could just say that you experienced an activity of solo hang gliding. Leave out the Mount Magazine part there. It could be in context, which is something we'll talk about shortly. Um, and sorry, excuse me. You could instead put that mountain where you were in context. So the point being, you can say a similar thing in several different ways, and depending on what you want to get across, you have choices about what goes in the verb and what goes in the activity. It depends on how you want to report on the data, what's the most important thing. If you care, if you just want to see everyone who's hang glided, you might have that be the activity. It again depends on how you want to sort the data. Okay, so now we talked about some very simple statements. There's actually several more pieces of statements that are important, and I'm going to have to go through these a little bit quickly. But a full statement, or the entire set of options a statement can have, looks like authority asserts that an actor did something in a context with a result. Context, very simply, is context. The English word context really tells you what it is. So everyone I think should know what context itself means, and it means the same thing with regards to statements. It's a circumstance under which a statement occurs. So it could include the instructor that is involved. If the statement isn't, say, Joe taught Sally, then if it's just that Sally learned something in the context of who the instructor was. It could be a team you were working with. It could be where you are when something is going on. It could be a platform. It could be a concept of a registration or just an LMS grouping of statements. Not necessarily from an LMS, but it's a concept that came over from the world of LMSs. So some examples. You can, if you want to say that one statement is about something specific, but it's part of a larger course, then that's where this concept of context activities and the parent comes in. The activity you're actually talking about, and then the activity which is the parent course. Platform, you can say what platform was used to report a statement. Pretty simple. It was reported from an iPhone. Result. Result should look very familiar to anyone who's familiar with other e-learning standards. Completion, success, score, duration. So we have those available as part of the statements. So we can say that Sally completed solo hang gliding and she passed. Success is true, and she had a score of 95%. Or we can say that she failed and she only got 2 out of 6. You can also include duration. This should be a familiar format again. But if not, you can go and look at CMI and at SCORM. But so we can say that she passed in 4 hours. And then again, talking about granularity of statements, we can say that she answered a particular question and that she did it in 8 seconds. This would actually be, if I have more room on the screen, a great example to also show where context could be used. You might want to include a context activity to say, hey, what test was this question part of? So, extensions. Extensions can be part of context, results, or activity definitions. Again, remember everything I said about URIs. They are, again, URIs. It's a pair of a URI key and a value. Um, and they provide a way to add more information into a statement for whatever your community of practice or particular application needs. Remember that applications can both write and read statements. So if your LRS or LMS doesn't come equipped with a reporting tool that works the way you want, you can add in your own extensions, and then you can also provide your own reporting tool if you want. That's possible now. You want the core statement to remain meaningful because there always will be systems that don't recognize the extensions. So ideally, it would be good if it was possible to identify some idea about what the statement was about. And then also take a look at the different places you can put extensions and make sure you choose the right one. So if actually, I'll just move on to the example and show an example of that. So here in result, we have an extension of meters climbed in the hang gliding example. So a result of what she did is she was able to catch a thermal and climb 500 meters. So that's part of result information. In context, we've added information on wind gusts. So the winds were gusting out to 17 knots. That's part of the environment that she experienced while she was experiencing this activity. Very briefly, there is a timestamp and there is a stored time in statements. Timestamp is when the statement actually occurred, and stored is when the LRS recorded it. So if you have an application that is collecting statements and it is going to issue it to an LRS later, it should still stamp the statement with when the event being described occurred, and then the LRS will handle stamping stored when it actually receives it. Similarly, if you're doing reporting, keep in mind the difference between those two. Finally, authority. Authority is who is saying this statement. Now, self-reporting is possible with Tin Can. I can say I did this. Ben says that Ben watched some YouTube video. I could also say that Ben says that Ben completed the high-stakes explosives training with a very important assessment. No one would want to believe that statement. So this is where authority comes in. Who says that this statement is correct? So that authority is set when creating statements. And of course, the LRS has to trust that whatever credentials are connecting to set that authority actually is appropriate. That is, I should not be able to connect to an LRS with my credentials and say that an instructor made some statement about me. Just another example of authority here. Okay. We have a statement generator, which I'd like to very briefly show you. And I have on the screen an example of a statement about attending this session. I'm just going to take this activity ID, which is tincanapi.com activities/tech-dive webinar, and I'm going to go to the statement generator. I've actually already filled this in here, and I've selected that I've attended the webinar. Put in a description, information about the activity. Generated the JSON of the statement. And then I'm going to go ahead and post that JSON. And I did this a little earlier too, so there's two of them, but you can see that I've attended this webinar. we can also do is we also have this bookmarklet. Bookmarklet is a prime example of the disconnection between what is recording a statement and what the statement is about. The bookmarklet allows you to surf around and click on it to indicate that you have experienced some web page. So again, if you go to tincanapi.com and go under Developers, Resources, Bookmarklet, so I've already done that, but it's just a matter of going here to Developers, then under Resources, Bookmarklet. You can put in your email address and name, or you could use an addexample.com email address if you don't feel like using your own email address. This is all going to a public endpoint. So part of why I bring this up, so my statement's been sent there and I should be able to see it. So you can see that I experienced the bookmarklet page itself, but of course I could click it on any other page as well. So example, I'll actually experience the statement viewer. And there we have it showing up. Part of why I bring this up is that the bookmarklet and the statement generators should be great tools to get started and for you to be able to see what you can do, and also look at the JavaScript behind this stuff and see how statements can be posted using JavaScript. Okay, and then this is, we're going to post these slides, of course, and there's various links that you can use to help you getting started. On tincanapi.com itself, we have a lot of resources. We also have a list of adopters. At tincan.adlnet.gov, you can go and they have information about how you can get involved in the standard development process. And then they have other good information there as well. And then they also publish a list of verbs and activity types, which are a good thing to keep in mind and consider using in your statements. There's something that really everyone who uses the Tincan API is going to be aware of. And then you should know as you are getting started that version 1 is to be released in the spring of 2013. So that's right around the corner. So if you want to get involved with a standard, you should do that soon. And certainly you can start using it at version 0.95. Even 0.9 will be around for a while, but I would encourage you not to start with that, but to start with 0.95. It doesn't really look like there are going to need to be many, certainly not many breaking changes. We don't really see any breaking changes at the moment having to get into version 1.0. That could change, but certainly the intent of the folks working in the spec community is that 1.0 should be very compatible with 0.95, that we shouldn't have this sort of major disruption that happened between 0.90 and 0.95. There's also some talk there about how to make sure that those 0.9 statements continue to be accessible. So at this point, I'd like to, we only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to see what questions we have that I can answer.
So yeah, the questions have been coming in and been posting answers to those. So if there's any outstanding questions, you can feel free to type them into the question box. Andy, our organizer, may be able to get you speaking if you raise your hand. So if you're interested in throwing a question out on the floor here, we can answer that way. But otherwise, yeah, I think that's it. I know this was a lot to digest all at once, but absolutely go check out tincanapi.com. The developer resources in particular are going to have a sort of a step-by-step replay of what you've heard today, and get that concept of an LRS across, get the concept of statements. We have a Statements 101 tech article, which will kind of go piece by piece through the elements of a statement, and just a lot of conceptual introduction and some things along those lines. All right. With that said, your chance to ask a question has not passed. At any time now or in the future, feel free to send an email to info@tincanapi.com. And we have plenty of people, Ben included, who can answer a question at any level you'd like to ask it. So please feel free to send thoughts, questions, and anything else you'd like to us there. And otherwise, Ben, I think we're done.
Yeah, I think so too. If there's no questions now, I'm glad you were able to answer everything.
Cool.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and yeah, hope to be hearing from
This
many of
is
you anyway.
one final note. This is Andy. Like we've done with some previous webinars, we'll be posting all of the questions that were submitted and answers provided to tincanapi.com as a blog post. So be on the lookout for that probably sometime early next week.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks.
All right, bye.
Bye.